Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Vishal Khandelwal, and this is the 1% Show. This show is an open ended exploration into the minds of the wisest people around to help us learn to think, invest, and live each day a little as 1% better. You can learn more at vishalkhandelwal.com. My guest today is PD Mangan. PD is a microbiologist, health and fitness coach, and an anti aging specialist. At 66 years old, which many people who see him don't believe, he's leading the way in teaching people of all ages how to improve their overall health. In today's episode, which is a departure from all my previous episodes with investors and CEOs, we discuss about the more critical subject of health, PD's own health journey over the past few years, and the biggest lessons he has to offer to anyone who wants to be healthy and at any age. Before we begin this conversation, I have a very small Zen story to share that I love and that somewhat fits the context of my today's conversation with PD. This story is about a Zen master who lived in the far outreaches of Japan. People would travel from far to seek his advice and ask for his wisdom. One day, a dignitary who was used to command and obedience came to visit the Zen master. He wanted to learn the Zen philosophy and started to talk about his existing knowledge of the subject. The master offered him a cup of tea, and while serving, he poured the dignitary's cup to the brim and then kept pouring. Finally, the visitor could not no longer restrain himself and blurted, "It's full, no more tea will go into this cup." The master stopped pouring, smiled at his guest, and said, "This is you, so full that nothing more can be added. Come back to me when your cup is empty. Come back to me with an empty mind, a beginner's mind." So, PD, I am not a health expert, as I mentioned, and maybe just a beginner who wants to explore this subject deeper for my own personal sake and for the sake of others listening to this podcast, who may largely be investors focusing on wealth creation and not on their health. I am conducting this conversation with PD today with a complete beginner's mind. And so I apologize in advance for any question I ask today that may make me seem like a fool. With this and no further delay, PD, welcome to the 1% Show, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thanks, Vishal. Thanks for asking me. It's my pleasure to be here. I have to make one correction to what you said earlier. I'm 67 now and rapidly approaching 68. But otherwise, everything you said was accurate. Anyway, thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. Thanks, PD. So I have done a brief intro, but for people who may not be familiar with you and your work, tell them who PD Mangan is, what work does he do, and the things that lead him to jump out of bed every morning.
Okay. Well, so yeah. So as you mentioned, I am a microbiologist. I suppose a better description would be former microbiologist because I no longer do that for a living. And that was a clinical microbiologist, not research. So what I do is I write on health and fitness. These days, my main venue is Twitter. Very active on there. And how I got there was how I got where I am. If where I am is an actual location, uh, is I just started writing. I started writing on my website. This was almost 10 years ago, and I started writing some books, and so I have written half a dozen books, and they're available on Amazon. I was kind of I kept writing my books and trying to find a way to make a living out of doing this. It is very difficult to make a living out of selling books unless you're a bestseller. And so anyway, I did a few things, and finally I was able to retire from my microbiologist position working in a hospital and to work in health and fitness full time. These days, I mostly uh, engage in health and fitness coaching. That's how I make my living. And what gets me out of bed in the morning? Well, I am generally pretty excited to get out of bed in the morning every day. I like to push the boundaries of what I am doing, push the push the boundaries of knowledge for other people. Um, it's just exciting. It's exciting for me personally because I am my own boss, so I get to do what what I want to do or direct myself in that way. I couldn't imagine at I mean, at my age, a lot of men are retired. They they're getting their collecting their pensions or what have you. Spend the day on the golf course or putting around in the garage or something like that. And that kind of life is not for me. I couldn't imagine doing that. I want to keep improving myself, keep improving my knowledge, keep pushing the boundaries of what I've achieved. So that's what gets me up in the morning.
That's wonderful, PD. You mentioned you are nearing 68 now, but you look much fitter than a typical 30, 35-year-old. I assume, and as much as I've read about you, you were not always that fit as you are now. So tell us about that story and your journey and what it is that led you to get into fitness so much over the past 15, 16 years or so, when you have made this big health transformation where you seem to be aging in reverse now. And the second question is, what are those few key changes that you've brought into your life that have helped you become healthier over the years?
Okay, great. Well, it is sort of a long story. I'll see if I can encapsulate it. My interest in health and fitness actually goes back quite a ways to when I was, let's say, 19 or 20 years old. When I realized I was getting kind of out of shape there, and I decided to, well, maybe I needed to do some exercise, do something about it. So I did, and enjoyed it. In reality, really, it even goes back further because as I've thought about where I have come from and why I'm doing what I'm doing, I realize that a lot of it traces back to the fact that my father developed heart disease at a fairly early age, around the age of 50. So this at the time this happened, this was at a time when there was a pretty good epidemic of heart disease going on in the United States. And so anyway, my father ended up living a good long life, but he did have heart disease. It affected him seriously in many ways, and I saw that when I was young, and I thought I don't want that to happen to me. So in any case, later on, when I was a bit older, I did get interested in fitness. Eventually, I started running. So in the 1970s, the running craze started happening. I remember when I first heard about running just for fitness, I thought it was kind of wild that anybody would actually just go out and run. But then, of course, it became very popular. Anyway, I started running, eventually started running long distances. I've run a couple of marathons in my life, and and habitually ran many miles every day or almost every day. Eventually, and I was always interested in my health and avoiding heart disease in particular. And I believed everything that came from mainstream health sources. For instance, that saturated fat caused heart disease. And so eventually I became a vegetarian because of this. So there I was running long distances and being a vegetarian, eventually a vegan even. And I was doing okay for a while, but then eventually I got sick. And with seemingly none of the doctors I consulted could figure it out. Eventually, I got a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome, um, and nothing seemed to be working. Nothing seemed to be happening. And somewhere along the way, I decided, and this was after, like I said, consulting many different doctors. Somewhere along the way, I decided that if I was ever going to be healthier, I had to try and figure this out for myself. And so I started to do some research. So, as I was saying, my background is microbiology. I've done a lot of biochemistry and pharmacology, also serious studies in those. So I was, more or less prepared to dive into scientific literature and see what it had to say and see what I could find out. And So I did find out a few things, and eventually I got better. I got healthier, and that led to what one of the things during this odyssey of chronic fatigue, which I had for 11 years. I thought to myself, well, if I ever figure this out and get better, then I'm going to have to write about it. I should write about it, and I should write a book about it. So actually, when I got better, that's what I did. So that was my first book. It was called Smash Chronic Fatigue, and then when I was done with that book and put it on up on Amazon, then I thought, okay, what do I do now? Well, okay, I guess I'll write another book. So one thing led to another, and then here I am doing what I'm doing now. As far as what I did to get healthier, there are a number of things, but I think two things are of great importance and also more relevant to other people generally speaking, and that was getting more animal protein in my diet. So and lifting weights. So one of the first things I discovered one of the first things I was confronted with when I started researching, trying to research and see if I could figure out the solution to my health problem, was that vegetarianism seemed like that might not be a good idea, and I was a little bit almost shocked when I first came across this because, like I said, I'd been adhering to mainstream dogma about saturated fat and so on. And I thought, well, what could be wrong with being a vegetarian or a vegan? It and so anyway, I read further and further, and eventually I thought, yeah, these guys are right. It's probably not a very good idea to be a vegetarian, and in any case, whether or not that was at the root of my problem, it certainly couldn't hurt me to stop being a vegetarian. So I did stop. And so I got better. Now, I would say that for many people, the problems are different. For example, I was fairly underweight at the time, and that is not the situation for most people today. So that part, we could get into this, but ultra processed foods are a big deal for most people. Quitting them, I was not consuming many ultra processed foods, so that part wasn't as relevant to me. But I wasn't consuming enough protein, enough animal protein, so I did, and I did start to get better slowly. And at some point, um, when I felt well enough to exercise, I picked up an old barbell that I had, and started moving it around. And it was very hard, but I continued doing it. And after a few weeks, I realized that I needed heavier weights, so I went and joined a gym and never looked back. Kept at it, put on 20 to 25 pounds of muscle in a year, and just kept on going. So that's basically what I did, and how I got from being ill with chronic fatigue to being reasonably fit at my age.
That's a wonderful story. You mentioned about diet, right? There's something about genes as well, and you mentioned that genetically, you may have faced an issue because your father got a heart attack very early in his life. So genes were probably responsible over there. How do you differentiate between disease which is caused by genes, and how do you get over that? Because you cannot turn that around. You cannot change your genes, but you can change your diet, right? So what does science tell you? How can someone who has bad genes get over it in some ways to live a long healthier life?
Right. So genes always interact with their environment. So except in relatively rare cases where people have a single gene that causes them, a severe illness. And there are diseases like that. Huntington's disease comes to mind, and various amino acid metabolic abnormalities that are all relatively uncommon. In things like heart disease, or in most cases cancer, or Alzheimer's, other diseases, there is a genetic component that is composed of the small actions of a large number of genes. Okay, so there's a lot of variance, and so on. I think the best way of saying this, and possibly the best example, is obesity. Okay, so obesity does have some genetic component. You can see that some people seem to be naturally heavier than others. It seems to run in families, this kind of thing. But the fact is that, just speaking only of the United States, obesity was uncommon 50 years ago. And now it is exceedingly common, and the genes have not changed. So what is happening is the environment has changed. So when one says that there are genetic causes to certain things, it's always in the context of the particular environment. So, for example, heart disease would be another example. Coronary heart disease, coronary heart disease, or coronary artery disease, number of different names for it. In the United States, around 1900, was almost unheard of. And in fact, there were cardiologists at the time. One of the great cardiologists of the 20th century, American cardiologist, Paul Dudley White, said that when he first started practicing cardiology, he never saw a heart attack, and they didn't study it because nobody was having them. And so the first published case of a heart attack, first scientifically, in the medical literature, first published case of a heart attack was in 1912. And then the heart attacks started going up and up and up, doubling and doubling again and again, until by 1965, in the United States, there was a huge epidemic of heart disease. Very famously, President Eisenhower in 1955 had a heart attack when he was in office. This raised a lot of awareness about what heart disease was. It was, front page news in all the newspapers at the time, and so on. And everybody was very concerned about him. And heart disease still kept going up even more and more. So again, here, the genes didn't change for heart disease. The environment changed. And several things, in my opinion, from what I have seen, could be responsible for this extreme increase in heart disease incidence in the United States. One of them is cigarettes. There were in 1900, not very many people smoked cigarettes. Of course, tobacco was widespread, but people were smoking cigars and or chewing tobacco, which does not involve inhaling cigarette smoke. And somewhere shortly around this time, machine rolled cigarettes were invented, and so and then cigarettes were sold and promoted. So a lot more people started smoking. So from like a couple of dozen annual cigarettes per capita in 1900, it went up to like 4,000 in 1965. So smoking became widespread. Smoking is a known cause of heart disease. So that's one. In 1911, I believe, trans fats were introduced into the food supply. So Crisco was this fat. It's made from hydrogenated vegetable oil. And so that became very popular. People used it because because it was cheaper and could be stored at room temperature. So trans fats, also a known cause of heart disease, went up. The use of them went way up in the 20th century. Sugar was another one. The consumption of sugar went way up, starting from 1900 to the middle of the 20th century, and even now. So there are a number of factors. In any case, I'm maybe belaboring the point, but the genes didn't change. The environment did. So obviously, if someone has some particular genetic combination that predisposes them to something, there's nothing you can do about it. The only thing you can do is to live healthy. So in that case, it's the advice would be no different in most cases for someone that had a genetic predisposition to something.
I can very well relate to your points with investing, right? So investing is a game of luck and probabilities, right? Even if you are trying to invest for the long term, you are still gambling into the future, right? Nothing is certain in the future as well, even for the long term, right? But the only thing that you can try to do is to bring the odds of success in your favor by doing the hard work, right? So you cannot, like you mentioned, you cannot change the genes, but you can change the environment which in which the genes are represented, so that you reduce your probability of disease much earlier in life and probably live a healthier life despite the genes that you have. You mentioned about saturated fats being bad, and which is a mainstream media health advice, which has been sold to us for many years. Sugar was hidden somewhere because there was a strong sugar lobby all these years, and you've seen sales of Coca-Cola and other beverages and other sugary products really skyrocket over the years. And probably one can also draw a direct correlation between the sales of sugary products and the increase in heart attacks and cancer across the world, not just in America. Uh, Apart from saturated fat being bad for us, what other common mainstream health advice do you disagree with?
I suppose there's a lot of them. Some of the most important ones is that I would say I'm extremely skeptical of the cholesterol hypothesis of heart disease. That's one. There are all kinds of indications that I mean, even if you ask the mainstream, they'll tell you all kinds of other things are far more important factors in heart disease. Like, for example, diabetics have tenfold risk of heart disease, and that doesn't seem to have anything to do with cholesterol. Anyway, that's one. Low salt diets or restricting salt. That's another one. There seems to be no reason for reasonably healthy people to restrict salt at all. In fact, low salt diets have been associated with higher death rates. And so there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with salt, at least in what we might consider normal amounts. And salt also, I mean, has been blamed on salt has been blamed for high blood pressure when the actual cause seems to be insulin resistance. So those are a couple of things of avoiding the sun. So since I've been young, doctors, dermatologists especially, have told people to stay out of the sun or use sunscreen, all this kind of thing, and that is bad advice. Of course, you should not get sunburned. That is true. I'm talking about reasonable sun exposure, that sort of thing. And reasonable sun exposure is a very healthy activity that more people should do. Most people are not getting enough. And that has led to an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency because the people have been avoiding the sun. I suppose one of the things that, I mentioned insulin resistance in the context of heart disease. So if we focused on that, so where I disagree with the mainstream, insulin resistance, this is what the mainstream does not recognize. Insulin resistance is behind virtually every chronic disease there is. Okay, this is really central to what I talk about and what is important in health. If you want to live a long time, you have to be insulin sensitive. So there's insulin sensitivity, and the opposite of this is insulin resistance, right? And so they exist. It exists on a continuum. It's not binary. Some people have some degree of insulin resistance, and others have more, and so on, till you get to the ultimate degree of insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes. Most people have, in the modern world, do have some degree of insulin resistance, and this leads to obesity, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all kinds of things, gout, that that people don't think of as being associated with this. And this is what the mainstream does not recognize. So how does one stay insulin sensitive? You do it by, one thing, having good body composition, which is a relatively low level of body fat and a relatively high level of muscle. Okay, so not necessarily talking bodybuilder level here, but everybody should be doing some kind of strength training. And I mean everybody, men, women of all ages, should all be doing some kind of strength training. Some may go for it more than others, but everybody should be doing it to build muscle, because people lose muscle as they age, and they can lose a lot as they age. You could get to the point where people have lost so much muscle that they're frail. They can literally can't even get out of their chair without help. And this is a disaster, because then people can't live independently, and then they end up in a nursing home or in bed all the time or something like that until they die, right? So that's the ultimate endpoint of muscle loss. And muscle is having a good amount of muscle mass is very important to insulin sensitivity. Body fat, you want to keep a relatively low amount of body fat. So it's not controversial to say that being overweight or obese is bad for your health. So it is, right? You want to have and part of the reason is because of insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. So you want to keep a relatively low level of body fat. How do you do that? Well, in my view, here's another thing, another area where I really disagree with the mainstream. So the most common mainstream medical view of how to cure obesity, how to treat obesity, is eat less and move more. And this is bullshit advice. Let's just put it that way. It does not work. If it worked, we wouldn't see so many overweight people around us, and people wouldn't have so much trouble losing weight. And they do have so much trouble losing weight. It's terrible, terrible advice. And so to be insulin sensitive, to have a relatively low level of body fat, you want to eat real whole foods. So I have often said to people that if I were only able to say, if somebody was going to give me 30 seconds to tell them what to do to lose weight and to be healthy, I would say, do not eat ultra processed foods, period. This is the stuff that comes in boxes and bags, sold in the middle aisles of the supermarket. This stuff that's made from refined grains, mainly flour, sugar, seed oils, also known as vegetable oils. This stuff is horrible. This stuff is, I would pinpoint those three ingredients, along with the ultra processed foods made from them, as the number one cause of obesity. And that would be the number one thing that people could do to get healthier. So there's where I disagree from the mainstream view that eat less, move more. So people try to just restrict how much they eat when, while eating the same things they ate before, just less of it. Then they're hungry, and so that doesn't last very long. That's very hard. And then move more. exercise is a completely ineffective way to lose weight, because you don't burn many calories. You don't burn that many calories in exercise. Exercise makes you hungry, and then it's all too easy to eat more than you burned after your exercise anyway. So exercise is a very healthy thing to do. It has a long list of health benefits. Unfortunately, weight loss is not one of them. You got to get the diet right. And people in my country are largely eating garbage all the time. It's terrible. So I kind of rambled there, but that's where I disagree with the mainstream. That's where I think we should focus our attention as far as having better health for more people. I have no I don't have any conceptions that these ideas that I'm talking about or are going to be widely popular. There are people, some of whom are with much better ability than I, that are also working on getting these ideas out there, and that is great. But what I feel that I do is speak to the individual. If you hear this and this makes sense to you, and what I say, I back up what I say with evidence, then maybe this is for you. This is how you can get healthy. The, the, the garbage food that is out there in the supermarkets and in the fast food restaurants and everywhere else is not going away in our lifetimes. There are too many economic incentives for it all to be there. Okay. It's relatively cheap compared to a lot of other food. And it is fast. People like that. A lot of people don't really want to cook much. And so they can grab things that are either ready made or easy to prepare. And furthermore, and the big food companies that generally make all these packaged and processed foods make a lot of money from them. They're highly profitable. The actual ingredients, I mean, so some of these national brands that are heavily advertised, they're very profitable because the actual ingredients that go into them don't cost much. You can imagine white flour, sugar, and vegetable oils. That's all dirt cheap stuff. So if you can make something out of them, like pizza or Cheerios or I don't know what, cinnamon rolls, donuts, and sell them, and then you can make a lot of money if you can advertise them. People like your brand, so the economic incentives are there. And then what I was also going to say is, furthermore, people like this stuff. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is there's a term for it called hyperpalatability. In other words, the idea being it tastes so good, you can't stop eating it, right? So, like a donut, for example. I mean, I used to like donuts way back when. It's been a long time, but yeah, I mean, if I was eating one donut, the thought in my head is, when's the next one coming? And with certain foods, you can just keep eating. So these are hyperpalatable foods. And so people like this stuff. There's another way of looking at it. There's supernormal stimuli. They concentrate stimuli that are found rarely in nature. For example, we do have a taste for sugar, so we're able to taste it, and so on. That taste would have been relatively rarely found in nature. Occasional, if we were in the Paleolithic stage before civilization, we would have occasionally come across a piece of ripe fruit, and we would have tasted sugar or perhaps honey from a bee's hive. But now these food companies have food chemists and food engineers that engineer this stuff so that it appeals to all these things that human beings like so much in a concentrated form. It's a bit like pornography. Pornography is a supernormal stimulus, because through pornography, men are able to vicariously, in their minds anyway, have sex with multiple women, right? Which normally doesn't occur in nature except for a few men. So it's like with these foods, they're doing the same thing in terms of we're getting this stuff um, in a state of nature. We would have been eager for any kind of food, and so these kind of foods appeal to this. They appeal to our senses. So in any case, I'm going on and on here. All that stuff is not going away. All the garbage food, it's going to be there in our lifetime. So it's up to the individual to figure this out for himself or herself and make the choice that you're not going to eat that stuff. It's often a tough choice because it's so ubiquitous, but that's the only way. For most people, that's the only way they're going to get healthy is by stopping eating that garbage.
I'm sure. Warren Buffett's, again, I'm talking about investing because that's my circle of competence. So, Buffett's business partner, Charlie Munger, has a very famous saying: all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I will not go there. Right now, the problem with food is that it's right in your kitchen, right next to you, right? And as you mentioned, that these are actually products. They are not food. They're products which are developed by scientists who know how to stimulate your mind, stimulate your taste buds, right? So that you can keep eating them, keep getting tempted about them, and keep eating them despite knowing that these are so dangerous. So what do you tell someone to make that person really avoid these foods, right? So one thing could be that these foods can kill you, right? So as simple as that, right? But how do you make me hate these foods so that I simply avoid them, right? No amount of rationale is going to turn a person's mind away from these kinds of foods and products because they're so obvious. They're all available in front of us, around us, right? In India, I'm not sure about the US. In India, you have these large corporate hospitals, right? Just outside their diabetes clinic and just outside their heart clinics, right? They have refrigerators loaded with such kind of products, right? So the products which are actually causing these diseases, even the
Yeah.
hospitals, the healthcare industry does not understand it. So you're fighting against the healthcare industry, you're fighting against the food industry, you're fighting against yourself to avoid these kind of food. So how does one actually get over that temptation?
That's a surprisingly difficult question to answer. There are some people that I think take to this message almost instinctively when they discover the reality behind eating this kind of food and what it does to people and what it does to oneself in particular. Then yeah, like I say, a lot of people will take to this and do something different, get away from all these foods. Often this is because people are obese and they've discovered that if they don't eat these foods and they eat something else instead, like real whole foods, then they lose a lot of weight. So you see, I mean, on Twitter, for example, you see stories like this daily. People talking about I lost 100 pounds, 150 pounds, what have you, by not eating these foods and by eating low carb, real whole foods, this sort of thing. So some people take to it, others never do. There are people who are type 2 diabetics who are, uh, it's really sad to even say it, but getting limbs amputated, going blind, this kind of thing, and some of them won't change. Um, one would think that at those extremes, someone would be very willing to change, but many are not. There could be various reasons for that. A lot of people, when you tell them these kind of things, like I've been talking to you about, refuse to believe it. They say, no, 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 my doctor's got me covered. I don't believe what you're saying. And I don't want to give up bread or pizza or donuts anyway. And so I'm good. Don't bother me. That it really is the attitude of a lot of people. So, I mean, I personally don't tell people. I mean, in the people that I know in real life, it's, well, if somebody wants to ask me something, I'm happy to talk about it. But I don't go around saying, hey, that thing you're eating there, that's going to kill you. That's not very, very welcome advice. People have to figure that out for themselves. So it's a really tough call. I mean, if you tell, it's almost a cliche where if you tell somebody, if somebody says like, I lost X number of pounds by giving up bread, and the cliche answer from a lot of people is, "Oh, I can't live without bread." That so it's a mixed bag, as far as who responds to it. Some people are relative, they're psychologically they have a high level of conscientiousness, and those are the people more likely to respond to it, and to endeavor to find out what the reality is behind this. People with a low level of conscientiousness that live from day to day, they prefer instant gratification and don't care as much.
I can relate so well with you. I teach about long-term investing, right, which has long payoffs. The gratification is not instant, right, and that's the reason most people, I'm sure, around you as well, are not long-term investors. They may be traders and speculators who want instant gratification. That happens with food as well, right, because getting gratified instantly. You are not, and good health has a long gestation period. So the steps that you're going to take today are going to pay off maybe 10 years, 20 years down the line. Some instantly, but some will take a long period of time, right? I'm sure in your case as well. And that's the reason most people cannot wait for that good outcome, and thus do not put the required effort to make the change to improve their lives better. Today, I think it was Mark Twain who said that it's easy to fool someone than to tell them that you have been fooled, right? So I think if I
Exactly.
relate it to food and health industry, probably it's easy to kill someone than to tell people that you are going to be killed by eating these kind of garbage food. So I so well relate to you. Vegetarians, right? So around 30 to 40% of Indian are vegetarians. I am a vegetarian too, though I can consume eggs occasionally. Now, given what you teach about the pillars of good health, which also includes meat, is there no hope for vegetarians to lead a healthy life or get over their diseases through food? So
There,
that's yeah.
there is hope. Yes, there is hope. It is possible to be um, pretty healthy as a vegetarian if it is done right. I believe it is almost impossible to be healthy as a vegan, which is no animal products. But yes, a vegetarian, if they do it right, can be reasonably healthy. I do think that there are nutrients from meat that are going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for vegetarians to get. Things like carnitine, carnosine, and other things that meat is abundant in. Nevertheless, vegetarians can do quite well. They should emphasize animal protein, in my view. So eggs and fermented dairy products would be the things that would give enough protein and enough of the other nutrients. And they should also emphasize real foods, namely um, vegetables and some fruits. And I say some fruits because I know, again, like in India, not only the vegetarians, but you seem to like your fruits over there. And I've seen videos of the fruit sellers selling these big sweet fruit bowls and people lined up for them and everything. And that is probably contrary to what almost everybody thinks. That is not healthy. That's just a big sugar treat. So you would want to emphasize animal proteins such as eggs and fermented dairy. You would want to emphasize real foods such as vegetables and some fruits, and you would want to de-emphasize refined grains such as white flour or white rice or things like that. The like the chapatis and so on that people make, uh, that's just empty nutrition, even harmful nutrition, things like that. And then also things like dal, lentils, are reasonably healthy thing. They're not refined grains. They don't have sugar or seed oils. Also, speaking of seed oils, I know that their use is very widespread in India, and so I would urge any Indians listening to this to get rid of that stuff. Ghee is much better, and from my understanding, ghee is also a lot more expensive, which is one reason why so many people are using vegetable oils. But yeah, the vegetable oils. I mean, India is becoming the diabetes capital of the world, and that is, that's terrible, and it doesn't have to happen. So anyway, there certainly is hope for vegetarians, but I think the way a typical vegetarian in India eats is probably far from optimal.
Mhm. If you were to design a vegetarian's plate, for example, a food plate, right? And you want to segregate between, say, carbs and proteins and fats, how do you design? What proportion of a typical plate would look like for you?
Well, I think one thing that vegetarians, especially in India, may lack is protein. So this is, I mean, I could get into this whole discussion about how important protein is with regard to chronic disease and with regard to obesity and diabetes and so on. But just the simple fact is, I believe most vegetarians are not getting enough protein. So you for a typical meal, you would want to probably have several eggs. You would probably want to have maybe some dal or similar dish like that is made from lentils or beans is relatively high in protein. You would probably want to also consume some yogurt or some I can't remember the name of it. It's very similar to cottage cheese. It's very common in India. The dairy product that have there, but whatever. Do you know the name of this off the top of your head? What I'm talking about? There's a type of cheese that is common in India. In any
Oh yeah,
case, eat that.
it's called paneer, cottage
Paneer.
cheese.
That's it. That is
Yes.
paneer. So I would have some paneer and or paneer or yogurt and eggs and dal, and that something like that. Maybe some vegetables. That to me would be, off the top of my head, a reasonably balanced vegetarian diet.
In fact, I've seen a few people in India, vegetarians, who go for a keto diet, right? High fat and almost no carb. The only two things that they eat are eggs and paneer the entire day,
Uh,
and for a lot of long period of time. The problem is that it's very difficult to sustain such kind of diets, right? If you're eating just two kind of food. So that's the reason I asked you, like, what's a typical plate would look like, which one can sustain, right? There are all these paleo diets and keto diets, which are all there, but in a country which is largely deficient on protein, right? Few resources for
right.
vegetarians and protein, right? It's very difficult to continue on such kind of diet for a long period of time. So your thoughts definitely are going to help over there. And as much as I understand from your ideas about food, right, it's more about avoiding the bad ones, right, than choosing the right ones is important, but avoiding the bad ones, which are all around us in India, especially now, in a young population where everyone is eating junk food. Food is delivered quickly to your home, right, and people don't have time. So I think that is an important thing over there.
And
You mentioned,
and
yeah, yeah, please.
and just yeah, an Indian friend of mine here in the United States, just his description of the standard Indian diet was flour and sugar fried in oil, and and of course, that I'm sure that's an exaggeration, but yeah, that doesn't sound too good. So people should avoid that stuff.
Yeah, if I look at my, say, grandparents, right, so there was a lot of flour and sugar, not white flour. Wheat was there. They had a lot of sugar. They had a lot of saturated fat, which was ghee, right? Not many people, or rarely people, would be eating vegetable oil. So it's the onset and the mass marketing of vegetable oils as a cheaper product, which has probably caused this issue in India. And also refined flour. So not many people, or probably, if I don't remember my grandparents ever eating refined flour or refined vegetables. It's almost like entirely ghee. They eat a lot of sugar, for example. In India, they ate some carbs in terms of wheat and everything, but they lived long. They lived healthily, right? So I think, as you mentioned, it's largely the bad foods which we are surrounded with, that we consume in loads, right? And not really doing the right kind of exercise, that really has caused the problem. Then eating the right kind of foods, of course, which is so important as well. especially about diabetes. You mentioned about diabetes, and India is sort of like the capital of diabetes. There's a surge, there's an epidemic, right? And I'm sure reading about a lot of stuff coming from you and from other people who I admire in this space, bad food, bad lifestyle has caused, not really genetics, because as you mentioned, genes don't change so fast. In 40, 50 years back, India was not so high on the diabetes chart. Now we are like nearly the top, probably the top in the world, after China, in terms of diabetes. So genes probably are not the cause. Uh, what's the solution? What's the solution for specifically for people with diabetes?
Well, diabetes, as I was saying earlier about talking about the concept of insulin sensitivity, insulin sensitivity exists on a continuum. So you go from very insulin sensitive, then to more insulin resistant, and then to eventually, then you get to things like metabolic syndrome, and then eventually to type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is basically the end result of a long chain of events, I guess you could say. And basically, in my country, I mean, 90% of the people in my country have some degree of metabolic ill health. So you could say that 90% of the people are on the road to type 2 diabetes. Not all will get there, of course, but that's where they're headed. So when you talk about diabetes in India and so many people having diabetes, it's in the reality is it's even a much bigger problem than that because most people are headed in that direction. And it's only a certain percentage that eventually develop full blown diabetes, but most people have some degree of insulin resistance. So, what is the solution? Well, for one thing, in an actual diabetic, type 2 diabetic, cutting carbohydrates is almost miraculous. So the main physiological defect in a type 2 diabetic is that they are glucose intolerant. So they eat something, they eat some carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are composed of glucose. This is the same glucose that's in the bloodstream, and they are unable to control it, and their blood glucose goes very high, and this is one of the main problems in diabetics. So it obviously follows that someone who is glucose intolerant should not be ingesting glucose, and that means no carbohydrates. So that means no bread, no sugar, whatever else is made from flour and white rice and a few other things. So that's definitely part of the solution. I mean, if somebody is taking diabetic medications, most especially insulin, they have to consult a doctor about this because hypoglycemia is a problem, especially if somebody is taking insulin. Um, but there is an outfit here in the United States that does telemedicine. It's called Virta Health, and they take diabetics and they basically cure them. I mean, in a year's time, 75% of them have stopped their diabetes medications, this kind of thing. So that is probably the first and most important step. The other things they can do, depending on whom you ask, these vegetable oils, I mean, of course, they are toxic, but they may be responsible for a lot of the physiological defects. Sugar, of course, as well, especially sugary drinks, and things like that, soda pop. Um, and then, of course, there's exercise, and that is very helpful. Although exercise is less helpful if somebody continues to eat all these things we're talking about. Ultimately, diabetes is, in my view, about body composition. Again, so you want to have a relatively low level of body fat, relatively high level of muscle. Also, diabetics have visceral fat, in other words, fat inside their abdomen. So weight loss is usually indicated for most diabetics, and they can do it with these means by getting rid of the garbage foods, by doing strength training and other exercise, So that would be the solution in my view.
I think the most important mantras that you practice and you talk about the three pillars of good health, right? For you, sun, stick, and steel. Sun means getting out in the sun. Stick is meat, of course, and steel is weight training or resistance training. The fourth S, I think you've talked about occasionally, is sleep, right? Getting a good sleep, and that's one of the most underrated subjects. So people talk about diet, people talk about exercises, but people don't talk about sleep. What is your take on sleep, and how does one develop a good sleep hygiene? If it's important, I'm sure it's important, but what's your take on sleep?
It is important, but there's an interesting distinction here, and I think that a lot of people have made it in some ways too important, and that is because uh, they have been convinced. A number of people have been health conscious people have been convinced that if they're not getting 8 hours of sleep a night, that this is going to impact their health in very negative ways, and that does not seem to be the case. Um, One has to have quite a bit of sleep deficit before statistically health defects start showing up. For example, 5 or less hours of sleep a night. And interestingly enough, longer sleep is more associated with mortality, for example. So you start seeing higher mortality rates at 8.5 and longer hours of sleep a night. As far as, but of course, sleep is important. And, um, and everybody wants to get a good night's sleep. And insomnia is, well, it's not fun. So good sleep hygiene, you would want to um, for one thing, you want to block blue light at night. So all our computers, our laptops, tablets, phones emit light in a blue wavelength, and this affects our sleep. It um, prevents the production of melatonin, which is a hormone that helps us sleep. So you want to block blue light at night. These days, virtually all computers, tablets, phones have built-in apps that will block blue light at night. So you want to set that up so that anytime in the evening, anytime after dark, you're blocking blue light. The screen will have a distinctively orange look to it. It's not the most productive way to work with an orange screen, but anyway, you would want that for sleep at any time after dark. And um, a few other things. Alcohol, for example, you don't want to drink alcohol anywhere close to bedtime. Alcohol disrupts sleep. So if one drinks alcohol, one would want to keep that away from bedtime, like by several hours. Um, Another thing is going to bed at the same time every night and getting up promptly. I have talked to a number of people that have had trouble sleeping, but were spending, let's say, 10 hours in bed every night, and we are not meant to sleep that much. So basically, they're trying to sleep more and more. See, this is the problem where when people think that they need 8 hours or more of sleep a night to be healthy, then if they don't get it, they are worried, and then they try to spend 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours in bed every night, and then then they develop insomnia because their body doesn't want to sleep that much. So in any case, some mild sleep restriction is actually beneficial for insomnia. So in other words, that would involve spending, let's say, no more than 7 hours in bed every night, regardless of whether you slept during that time or not, and restricting your sleep in that manner, and then after a while, after a few days or perhaps longer, one gets to the place where you go to bed, yeah, and then you're out for 7 hours because that's what you're meant to do. But a lot of people, in my view, are developing insomnia because of this. So all those things for sleep hygiene. There are some other things. You want to sleep in a room that is totally dark as possible. Also, Uh, Air temperature, you would want it relatively cool. That's conducive to sleep as well. So there are all those things that can help sleep.
Mhm. I forgot to ask you about the metabolic disorders that you talked about, and how does one measure them, right? I remember, I think very recently, or probably just yesterday, you I think tweeted about it in terms of the ways one can measure the problems. One number was triglycerides less than 150, and I think HDL more than 40. What are the other quick tests or quick ways to find out whether one is insulin?
Right. So those things that I tweeted are the five factors in metabolic syndrome. You're considered to have metabolic syndrome if you have any three of the five. And so they are low HDL, high triglycerides, high fasting blood sugar, high blood pressure, and high waist size. So if any three of those means you have metabolic syndrome, and basically you're just kind of one step away from type 2 diabetes at that point.
You have written about the importance of intermittent fasting in the past. Now, there are many versions and definitions of the same that we come across from multiple resources. Some talk about a 12-hour fasting, some 16 hours, some once a week, and some talk about just one meal a day. So, first, tell me your thoughts on why intermittent fasting is good for us based on what the science of our bodies tell us, and how can one fast to gain the maximum benefit out of the same?
Okay. So intermittent fasting, I think the best way of looking at this, so it's well described in the scientific and medical literature how beneficial it is. The question is, why is that? Well, best way to describe this, I think, is to go back about it's almost 90 years now, when a scientist named Clive McKay discovered that feeding rats less than they wanted to eat resulted in them living a lot longer. So this intervention is known as calorie restriction. It is the most robust and effective anti-aging intervention there is. Animals, small animals like rodents, live a lot longer when they don't get enough to eat. And this was surprising. So I'm talking about like 50% longer even than other rats that are allowed to eat as much as they want. So what's going on there? Well, there's been a lot of research, massive amounts of research into what exactly is happening with calorie restriction that makes rats and other animals live longer in better health. Recently, so a little detail about some of these experiments is that um, if you keep rats under caloric restriction, they are obviously very hungry. And then if they're in a laboratory, they're in a cage, you feed them. So they're so hungry, they eat everything all at once. And then they don't eat again for 24 hours. So the question is it because of caloric restriction or is it because they're fasting? And some recent research has indicated that it might very well be just because they're fasting, and that fasting alone without caloric restriction is just as effective in terms of health benefits and life extension as is caloric restriction. So that's probably what fasting is doing. There has been some discussion about, for instance, in laboratory animals, are they just being fed a lot of junk, commercial grains and so on, lab chow, basically, and that they're eating less of this. And likewise, are human beings just eating a lot of junk so that if they eat less of it, they're better? Well, I think that could have something to do with it, but I don't think that explains the whole thing. I think fasting and caloric restriction are beneficial in themselves. As to different kinds of intermittent fasting that people can do, I think to start with, there is what I would call normal fasting. This is what I've termed it. So in other words, it's normal for someone not to eat between their evening meal and their morning meal. Let's call it 12 hours. So that would be something that everybody should do. And in fact, these days, a lot of people are not even getting that far. So people are eating basically around the clock with a little break for sleep. Um, but then you extend that 16 hours of intermittent fasting is something that I would call pretty much the minimum to actually to count as fasting to get some of the benefits. And then longer is better, 18 hours, 20 hours. For example, one meal a day that people do, some people do. And then longer fasts can be definitely beneficial and more effective. So some people practice fasting for several days. Something I've never personally done myself, but that can be very beneficial. So there are a number of um, physiological, biochemical things going on that this is definitely fasting promotes that promote better health and long life. So it is a very healthy practice, and a whole lot more people, probably just about everybody, should be doing it.
Mhm. What kind of fasting do you practice, or do you, if you really practice fasting as of now?
I myself, I fast usually no more than about 16 or 18 hours, and I do that probably 4 or 5 days a week. Yeah.
You've also written about the importance of supplementation for our bodies, given that the quality and the quantity of essential nutrients we receive from food have come down over the years. But there are a lot of supplements promoted by a lot of people with misaligned incentives, given that people consider supplements as an alternative for good food, which I think they are not. What are your thoughts on supplementation, and what are the most essential supplements one can be taking regularly? So not an advice, but most essential supplements that one can be taking, especially if someone is a vegetarian and not getting animal protein.
Right. You're certainly right about all the supplements, and there's a lot of nonsense being promoted about this or that supplement. A lot of people like supplements because they um, would prefer to add something rather than to stop doing all the things that they're doing, like to stop eating the junk or anything like that. So they figure, well, if they can just add a supplement, this will take care of their problem. Nevertheless, there are some real uses for supplements. My rule of supplements is the more expensive a supplement is, the less it's likely to work or to be effective. So some very basic supplements. You mentioned about vegetarians. So the number one supplement there that would be beneficial for vegetarians has got to be creatine. So creatine is a molecule that's found in meat and no other foods. Also, our bodies make a lot of it, a certain amount of it anyway. And creatine is found to be very beneficial for vegetarians. So if someone who eats an adequate amount of meat takes creatine, they might only get marginal benefit, if any, because there's already creatine in meat. But vegetarians can definitely use it. There was an interesting study done a few years ago where vegetarians performed much better on, I think it was an IQ test, some sort of cognitive test, after they had supplemented with creatine, because the brain uses creatine as well. So that would be my number one supplement for vegetarians. Another good supplement for vegetarians would be whey protein. So that is, and of course that's vegetarian compatible because it's made from whey, which comes from milk. Um, so yeah, whey protein has got branched chain amino acids and other important amino acids. So yeah, most vegetarians could probably use whey protein. Other supplements, magnesium. So this is more. This is good. This goes beyond just vegetarians. Magnesium has been depleted from the soil, and a lot of people are deficient in magnesium. One study in the United States found that as many as something like 65% of the population were not getting an adequate magnesium in their diets. And also things like caffeine and alcohol can result in increased excretion of magnesium. So Magnesium is another one that a lot of people could benefit from. Vitamin D is another one. So we were talking about the sun earlier. Sun creates vitamin D in the skin. A lot of people don't get enough sun. Also, a lot of people live in northern climates and so on where they can't get adequate sun. So a lot of people could use vitamin D supplements. So yeah, those are probably some of the most basic ones that would help a lot of people.
Wonderful. So, PD, we are nearing the end of the conversation, and I have a few typical questions which I asked all my guests, right? The first of the question is, what are your most favorite books on health, on life, on living, or whatever you read from your library, right? That anyone can read and benefit from that.
Um, well, so as far as on health, the books of Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, excuse me, have been remarkable, and I've read them over and over again. So they are very good from the aspect of health and fitness. Other As far as the other things that have influenced me a lot, I have read a lot of philosophy in my life. I'm the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer is a favorite of mine, so I've read a lot of his works, and a very American book called Walden by Henry David Thoreau. It's well known in this country, but that had a big influence on me when I was younger. Basically, it's about really living your life and not letting somebody else live it for you.
Uh, in the last 5 years, what new behavior or habit has most improved your life outside health? So, I'm sure it's all about health, but outside health, what's the habit that has most improved your life?
Uh, Outside of health and fitness, I would probably that's developed in the last 5 years. I guess I would have to say Twitter, because I'm making my living through Twitter. And so that's, when you put it that way, what's benefited my life, something that I'm doing. Yeah, I would have to say doing that.
I got to know you from Twitter, so I'm sure. Thanks for that. uh, what is the single best piece of advice you ever got? And what is the single worst piece of advice you ever got?
Right. The single best piece of advice I ever got. Maybe it is, don't care what other people think. Something along those lines. I'll tell you, I feel like I went through life without a lot of very good advice, and unfortunately, then one has to figure it out on one's own through sometimes through infliction of pain on oneself. That's how you get the lesson. Um, but that's one thing I have learned. I think that not living your life on someone else's schedule or on what someone else thinks you should do, I think that is very important, and that has served me well. What is the worst piece of advice I've ever gotten? That's hard to say, but I think maybe I could generalize it into the opposite of what I just said, and that is just go along with what everyone else is doing. For example, when you're 18, you're supposed to go to university. Then you graduate and you get a certain job working in an office, perhaps. Then at a certain age, you're supposed to get married and have children. And then you're going to spend several decades working at a job, for most people, that they hate. And they do it just to get some money. And then at a certain age, you're going to retire and maybe you play a little golf, and then you're going to die. Um, that's no way to live life, and that's how, at least from my perspective, a lot of people are living their lives.
If you had one piece of health advice to someone, what would it be? Just one piece of health advice.
One piece of health advice: don't eat anything that comes in a box or a bag or a can. Don't shop in the inside of the supermarket. Shop around the perimeter of the supermarket. By the way, I've talked to people all over the world, and they, including in India, in Africa, everywhere, Europe, Asia. They all tell me the same thing: ultra processed foods are sold in the middle aisles of the supermarket because that's the most profitable. That's where they want you to buy. And real whole foods are all sold on the perimeter of the supermarket all over the world.
And my final question to wrap it up, you're 68, right? And I'm sure you have a lot of wisdom to share on a good life. So my question is that everyone walks on their own journey of life and everyone must play their parts well. But what, according to you, is a life well lived?
I think the answer to this is quite sex differentiated. I think the answer is different for a man than for a woman, generally speaking. For a man, I think a life well lived is to develop your potential, to feel that what is in you, to bring it out, to create, to work, to change the world in your favor, in the favor of humanity, and change it for the better. Um, there's a there's a concept of the psychologist Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. We start off with, for example, wanting basically food, clothing, and shelter, right, for our biological needs. Then we move up to we want love from someone. Then we want various other things until we come to the top of the pyramid, which is what he called self-actualization, which is bringing it out of yourself, developing yourself. Um, so I think that's a way to live. That's the highest way to live for men. I think with women, maybe not so much. Women are more nurturing. They look after they are nurturing towards children, and they raise children. And what my observation is that for most, many if not most women, that's one of the highest things they can do. That's what they see as their calling.
Wonderful. So thanks, PD. I received a lot of great insights from you, and I hope I did not sound foolish at a moment in this conversation and did not really trouble you with my stupid questions. But you've been great in terms of answering everything that I had, and probably more than that. And I'm sure the listeners and the viewers of this podcast are going to get a lot of great ideas and great thoughts and about how to lead a good life, how to lead a healthy and happy life from you. So thank you so much for everything you've shared.
Thanks for having me, Vishal. I detected no dumb questions whatsoever, so don't worry about that. And I'm happy to be here. And thanks again for inviting me.